needed to be, and we have way too much material. We're going to run out of time, and at the end, I take a lot of pride in trying to do a good job in teaching God's word. And this time it's kind of, it's kind of like the way my grandma fed the dogs. What a friend of mine from Australia, he would say, well, he's actually from South Africa. He would say a dog's breakfast. So probably the Lizette's the only one that's probably ever heard of that saying before. But it's going to be just kind of whatever's left over and all over just thrown out. That's kind of what I'm going to have. It's going to be a big mess. But if you just stay with me, I'm going to trust you to pick out the one or two things that speak to you, because the rest of it you can just throw away. It won't be any problem. Anybody born someplace unusual? I was born in Oklahoma. Okay, go ahead. Tokyo. Yeah, that counts. Somebody born unusual. Lizette. Namibia. Okay. We got one. Tracy. Las Vegas. In a hospital? Okay, it's less than usual. All right. No. All right. Where else?
I was born in my grandpa's office.
In your grandpa's what?
Office.
Your grandpa's office. Was he a doctor?
Yeah.
Okay.
In Murray.
In Murray. Okay. Anybody else? You're born someplace? As a child? Okay. Where, Utah? We have some people born in Utah? Look at this. We got this whole room of people. We got 2 people born in Utah. That is weird. We need to get out and we need to talk to some people that were born in Utah about Jesus. Will, can I get an amen? Yeah. We only got 2 people in here that were born in. Linda, were you born in Utah? No. Ohio? Okay. Ohio. Oh, we got Ohio. All right. Where you're born matters. Where you're born matters. It matters tremendously. I don't care who you're voting for. I don't care what your politics are, and I don't want to talk about any walls. But I have a friend. He's 25. His name is Christian. He goes by Chris. And he's lived in the United States of America for 25 years and about 6 months. Only problem is he's 25 years and 9 months old. So for 3 months, he lived in Mexico. And so he decided to come here illegally when he was 3 months old. And now he speaks very, very little Spanish. And he is not a citizen of the United States. He's lived here his whole life. He pays taxes, has a job. I've worked with him for a few years, but he can't become a citizen because he needs to talk to some people in Mexico, and it's very difficult, and it costs money. But this is the only place he's ever lived, so he's not technically here legally. Where you're born matters. And that's what happens with Paul. We didn't get there last week, but Paul they go into, if you remember, he comes back to Jerusalem. We're going to have less discussion than usual. He comes back from Jerusalem. He has a gift. He brings the gift of money because these people are having a difficult time. They don't have food. It's a very difficult situation. Paul comes in and he's got money. And when he gets there, the members of the way, the cult, which is what they called us, the cult, which if we were back then, some of y'all would have called us a cult too. They went in, probably me. So they went in and they said, look, so this doesn't just so that the Jews don't just come and cause a huge problem. We want you there's some guys here, they have a vow and they need to go up to the temple and they need to offer some sacrifices to end their vow. And so Paul goes up to the temple because he's got to give them a warning that you got to get the right animals because we got these guys that are going to do the vow. And Paul's got some money. I can pay for the animals that we need for the sacrifice for the vow. He gets up there. He brings with him a Greek. He leaves the Greek in the outer courts. The Greek doesn't come in. He said, you stay out here. You can't come into the inner, because only Jews are allowed. But then some Jews come and they see and they start causing, oh yeah, he's got the Jews, he's brought some Greeks into the temple, and all of a sudden they're starting to this big thing, starts a big row. And so when this was all what we talked about last week, and so then they said, hey, we're going to we're about in 23. Right before he gets to 23, he's at the end of chapter 22, that they said he gets everybody calmed down, and they listen. It comes in there, and there is a guy that's in charge. You know, they used to say at the baseball games, you can't tell the players without the program. My dad loved that saying, but he never would buy me a program. But I have a whole program, because there's a lot of characters in here, and you'll get confused, and you don't have it, and I'll forget it, but we do know who the players are. So they come in, Paul goes in, he gets them all calmed down, and they're listening to what he has to say. And Paul he's talking to them, and then he says that God has sent me to talk to the Gentiles. Well, that did not go over. That was worse than not going over. That started the whole thing up again, and they thought, then the commander, so they said, then the crowd listened to Paul. In verse 22 of chapter 22, they said, the crowd listened to Paul until he said that. Then they raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live. Whew. It heated up. It's heating up big. And they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air. And the commander, he's going to play. He would be gets a part in this, and his name is going to come up here in a minute. And I must have erased it. Oh, it's Claudius Lysias. So he's going to be a player. So the commander comes in, he talks to him, and he said, they're going to have an uprising, and they're going to be. So he takes Paul away, and he orders him to be taken to the barracks. And he's going to be flogged and questioned in order to find out basically why are the people doing all this shouting and causing all this riot. So that's what they're going to do. They get Paul, they take him into the barracks, they get ready to flog him, and as they're getting ready to flog him, Paul says what? He said, I am a citizen of Rome. Is it legal for you to just flog me as a citizen of Rome? And then, whoa, the guy that was getting ready to carry out the flogging, he goes to Claudius Lysias, and he says, the centurion heard this, and he went to the commander, who's Claudius Lysias, and he reported it. What are you going to do? He asked, this man is a Roman citizen. Where was Paul from? Saul, his first name was not Paul, it was, and he was Saul of, okay, where's Tarsus? Your whole life, you've said. It's at the bottom edge of Turkey. You know what that makes it? Turkey. So Saul is from Turkey. And so so he did not grow up in Judea. He is from Turkey. He's what is in modern day Turkey. That's where Tarsus is. And so Saul, since he was born, remember, it matters where you're born. He was born in Turkey, and he was by birth a Roman citizen. So when they get ready to flog him, he comes out and he says, wait a minute, I'm a Roman citizen. And then all of a sudden, that's a problem. So that guy, Claudius Lysias, he calls him up and he says, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And this is verse 27. It says, yes, I am, he answered. And then verse 28, the commander said, I had to pay a big price for my citizenship. And so Claudius Lysias was also a citizen of Rome, but that makes us think he was probably Greek because he purchased citizenship. He wasn't a citizenship by birth. Like my friend Christian, he will have to pay some money to become a citizen of the United States and get an appointment in Mexico that he's trying to work through so that he can become a citizen of the United States. So this is like, he said, I had to pay a big price for it. And he said, but when the commander found out, he was alarmed because he realized that he had put a citizen of Rome in chains. Now, And I'm not blaming Brett because we got way too much material. That was all supposed to be covered last week. And we're 15 minutes in, and we haven't even got to all of this stuff and the John Nash Beautiful Mind stuff. So here we go. So the next day, the commander wanted to find out exactly what was this. And so he calls together the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin shows up, and the Sanhedrin, hey, could we stop having the chat back here on the next to the last row? Okay, so we had a, just kidding. If you're watching at home, that was my wife, okay? Come on and join us. I will not be mean to anyone.
Forever, I just thought for some reason that Paul was the one who purchased the citizenship, even though he was born a citizen. But it looks like the way the language is and the punctuation is that the commander is the one who paid for his citizenship.
The commander paid for his citizenship. Commander was probably Greek. Paul was a citizen by birth because he was born in Turkey, which was controlled by Rome. So here we go. They go before the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. And so Paul goes and he tells them this great story, and they're listening, and he understands, but Paul's not an idiot. He's sitting here and he knows that some of these people are Sadducees, and he's talking about, I'm no different than all of these people. He's trying to get Claudius Lysias to understand he said, I'm just like these guys. And I believe in the resurrection. I believe that who was dead, Jesus, came back to life, was resurrected, and I believe in the resurrection. And he said, I used to go around being mean to people that believed in the resurrection, but now I celebrate and believe in the resurrection. As soon as he says that, the spotlight shifts away from Paul, and they start fighting because the Sadducees, what? They don't believe in the resurrection. So the Sadducees, they start bumping heads with the Pharisees, and that becomes a bigger deal than Paul. So you know what? There's an old saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So that was kind of like, now all of a sudden the Pharisees were like, well, yeah, we're in with Paul because we believe in the resurrection. We're not like these silly Sadducees that don't. So they're saying he's probably okay. And so they get this whole thing. There was a great uproar. Verse 9, and some of the teachers of the law were Pharisees stood up and they argued vigorously. They said, we see nothing wrong with this man. What if the spirit or an angel spoke to him? Then the dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away by force and put him into the barracks. And the following night, all this has happened, boom, 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 boom. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and he said, take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, you will what? You will also do so in Rome. Now, we'll slow down for about 90 seconds. You will also do so in Rome. In about 54 AD, Paul wrote the letter to the church at Galatia. In about 54 AD. This is where we go into the John Nash, and we'll never get out. If you go down this rabbit hole, you'll never get out. So don't just follow on at the top level. Somewhere between 55 and 58, he writes the letter to the church in Rome. Those are the last two epistles that we have in our Bible that Paul wrote before he's arrested in Jerusalem, which occurs in either late 57 or early 58. So if you were born in 1958, then it was 1900 years ago. It's very simple math. So you were arrested in 57 or 58. So that is where he's arrested. So the last two books, the last two letters that Paul has written are Galatians and Rome. And if we were to have a whole week, we would turn to Rome and we would read the first chapter of Romans beginning in verse 8. And it says Paul longs to do what? He longs to come to Rome. So he might have just written this a month or two before, where he wrote that he longed to go to Rome. And so now here he is, this has happened. And so it's not very long after he wrote this letter to the church at Rome that he gets a message from the Lord who stood near Paul and says, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, you must also testify in Rome. That's a biggie. Has Paul had any type of a prophecy about returning to Jerusalem? Yes. What was the prophecy? That he was going to be. Somebody said that one guy said he'd be killed, but then somebody took their what? Their belt. They took Paul's belt and they tied him and said, look, this is what's going to happen to you. Wouldn't it be strange if I came over and I took off your belt and I started tying up? He said, that I guess if you're doing prophecy, that's okay. It works. So you're going to be, you're going to be bound when you get back to Jerusalem. And so that's what's going to happen. Now we're at the start. The next morning, this is Luke. He's very good to give us some time. You know, Luke was a scientist. He was the physician, and he has given us a lot of detail. So it's the next morning. The next morning, there were some Jews that form an agreement. They say, look, I need to not eat as much, but I wouldn't make this kind of deal. He said, we are not going to eat until what? Until we what? Till we kill Paul. We are not going to eat until we kill Paul. That was their plan. So they formed a conspiracy, bound themselves with the oath not to eat or drink till they killed Paul. Whew. All right. Yeah, this is crazy. All right. So they said, we made it this thing. We're not going to do it till they are going to kill Paul. And so then if we get to in verse 12, Paul has a nephew. Paul has a nephew, and he's younger because they describe him, he's described as a young man. And so somehow Paul's nephew finds out about this group of people that want to kill Paul. And so Paul's nephew goes to see Paul while he's in prison. So while he's in prison, well, it's not really prison. He's in the barracks because they're trying to figure out what they're going to do with him. And they say, okay. And let's see, we get down to verse 23:12. The next morning, the Jews formed this pact, and there were 40 men involved in the plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders, and we've taken this oath. We're going to kill them. And now you just you guys get to Sanhedrin and tell them that you want to bring Paul back because you want to ask him some more questions. And when they're bringing him out of the barracks, boom, we'll get him and we'll kill him. And so, but when the son of Paul's sister, verse 16, he went into the barracks, he told Paul, and Paul told the centurions, and the centurion Paul said, hey, take this guy to the commander. So they go to Claudius Lysias, and the commander says, he said, they wanted me to bring this young man. He has something. And so this guy tells the commander, tells Claudius, the nephew, the young boy, I don't know how old he is, but he says he's a young man. I don't know, probably a teenager, hopefully. Maybe he's younger. And he goes in and he tells Claudius Lysias, he says, hey, these guys, if you move, the Sanhedrin's going to call for him. And if you move him, then these 40 men are going to kill my uncle Paul. And we don't want that. And so Claudius Lysias says, oh, no. He said, I don't want somebody, a Roman citizen, getting killed on my watch. This is a big deal. So here he goes. He says, we got to do something. And they go crazy. In verse 23, the commander, he dismissed the young man. He said, don't tell anyone that you reported this. And then verse 23 of chapter 23, he called his centurions and he said, get ready a detachment. And so they've got one guy that they're trying to protect. And so what did they do? We got a military man right here. You know what they do? They bring out the big guns. I mean, literally, and it's not guns. They're not invented yet. But they bring out a lot of muscle. Thank you. They bring out, I'm getting some hand motions in the back. I thought we were doing, my God is so mighty and so powerful. But anyway, he brings out the big guns, and the big guns come in and they say, let's say, get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight and provide mounts for Paul, so Paul gets to ride, so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. So are you following along with this? This is pretty cool. He's saying he gets 200 of the soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen, and they're going to take Paul to Caesarea at 9 o'clock at night. So before any of this can happen the next day, they're saying, whoo, we're getting him out of here. Here we go. So he's going to Caesarea. Why go to Caesarea? That's where the Roman headquarters of Judea was. So I get, this is very confusing, but it's really not. And maybe this doesn't work for you, but it kind of works for me. So we have a government in Utah, and that's a state government. And so there's a state government, and that government is separate from a federal government. So whose authority are we under? Are we under Utah's authority, or are we under the federal government's authority? Yeah, we're under both, aren't we? So this is kind of what's going on here. So they're saying, look, we're going to go, and this is a weird crossroads, that happens. You've got the Roman authority, and the Roman authority comes in, and they are technically over everything, although it's more loose than perhaps you might imagine it to be. But there's also a local authority, and the local authority is a Jewish authority. So anytime you're reading the Bible, the New Testament, and it says King so-and-so, then that's probably closer to like, anybody know who our governor is? Cox. So thank you. I forgot. So I'm not a big politics guy. So this is kind of like the king is kind of like Governor Cox. But then when you start going up, you can go up the chain, and you can start going up to people that are in federal government. And eventually you get all the way up to somebody who doesn't live in Utah anymore. You get up to somebody that lives in Washington, D.C. I know that one. It's Biden. So here we go. We've got a president. And so that's kind of what we've got going on here. So they go and they get him. Claudius Lysias, verse 26. Now you finally pick up his name. Claudius Lysias says to His Excellency Governor Felix, hey, they got this man. They wanted to kill him, and I was informed of a plot. I don't know what to do. It's getting pretty volatile here. So I'm sending him to you, so you figure out what to do. And so the soldiers carried out their orders. And when the cavalry, verse 33, when the cavalry arrived at Caesarea, they delivered the governor. They handed over Paul, and the governor read the letter. And he said, I will hear your case when your accusers get here. So we got to have somebody that can come in and testify. And so that's what they do. So in chapter 24, verse 1, 5 days later, due process. 5 days later, he's going to boom, boom. Everything has happened in days so far. This is a week. It's taken us a week. And they get here, and eventually he is going to talk to Felix. Did Felix not make my board? So he didn't. Hang on. No, so Felix is a Roman governor, and he has basically a mixed ethnicity, probably of Greek origin. And so there's a lot of stuff going on. And so he has to handle these conditions. And so he calls Paul there in verse 24. And then in verse 5, his accusers show up, and it says, we have found this man they bring three charges against Paul. So when I say the accusers are show up, and I think it's the elders and the chief priests, or the high. They said, we acknowledge with 5 days later, when some. Oh wait! I'm almost. And a lawyer, Tertullus. So they have he's on the program. He's a professional orator, a lawyer. He represents the Jewish authorities. He's likely been skilled somehow in Roman law, And so they bring him. He knows something. He's going to go up here and he's going to talk so that they can have this hearing in front of Felix. And so he says, we have enjoyed, and they go in and they make an opening statement. If you watch, I don't know if you watch Law and Order, but they make an opening statement. Jeff, we got a comment here.
I think Tertullus is doing a great job of sucking up here.
Well, so will Paul. Don't judge too quickly. So he makes his opening statement and he says, we've enjoyed a long period of peace under you and blah, blah. You've done such a great job. And now you've just been in everywhere, in every way, most excellent Felix. We acknowledge this with profound gratitude, blah, blah, blah. And we don't want to make you just drag this on. You just hear us briefly, and we've got 3 charges we want to bring against this man. The first charge is that he's a troublemaker. He stirs up riots among the Jews. That's number 1. Number 2 is that he is the ringleader of a cult, the Nazarene sect. And the number 3, they tried to desecrate the temple. Of the 3 charges, the best is last. Number 3 is the most important, desecrate the temple. Anybody have any idea why that's the most important? What was that? That's where God lived. That's where God lived. But why? And in court, why is that the most important?
Because you just said that Jews were predominantly the other.
Well, it is. That's a great point. I hadn't thought about that. But the big thing is the first 2 things are problems that Rome is going to take care of. If he's talking, you're not allowed to introduce new gods. So if you're talking about a new god, then you can't be doing that. And you're out here and you've got this crazy riot. Then those are things that the Romans are going to take care of. The Romans, they try to stay out of the religious arguments. So they try to keep out of the religious situation. And so they are allowed to bring the punishment for the desecration of the temple. Because that's a violation. That's not a violation against Rome. That's a violation against the Jewish religion. Who built the temple? Herod the Great. So Herod the Great is the person who makes the second temple. He does this big remodel project. And I mean, it makes your remodel project look tiny. This is the huge deal. And he makes this temple. Herod the Great is the first of the Herodian dynasty, which goes on for about 100 years. And his mother is a Hasmonean. He has a son named Aristobulus. Maybe, I don't know. So but he becomes as Herod the Great gets older, he starts to he starts to worry that these people, their mama is from a Hasmonean, and he's like, and Herod the Great was raised as a Jew. So this guy is a Jew. And he thought that if you wanted to be in his family, you needed to be Jewish. So if you were going to marry one of his daughters, you had to become a Jew. You had to become circumcised. So now you've got a very heavy leaning Jewish tilt. So here we go. They go into, we'll come back. So they go in and they talk to the governor. And so now it's Paul's turn to speak in verse 9. And the governor motioned for Paul to speak, and Paul replied, I know for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. And you can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago, I went up to Jerusalem to worship. So I haven't been there for months and years, causing all kinds of disturbance. I basically just rolled into town 12 days ago, and now all of a sudden all this, and they did not find me arguing, verse 12, with anyone, and that I went into the synagogues or the crowd, and they cannot prove any of these charges. Verse 14, however, I admit that I worship the God of our fathers, as a follower of the way, capital W in my book. It says, so followers of the way, which they call a sect or a cult. I believe everything that agrees with the law and that is written in the prophets. And I have the same hope in God that these men have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear. And then he said, after several years of being away, I brought some gifts for the poor people. I was going to present some offerings, and I was ceremonial clean, and I went into the temple. And it says, then there was a shouting, and they came, and unless they stood in the presence, I was concerning the resurrection of the dead on the trial. Then verse 22, Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings, and he said, when like Claudius Lysias, the commander, comes, I will decide your case. And he ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him freedom and permit his friends to take care. Several days later, Felix and his wife, Drusilla, who was a Jew. So if you come down here, you see Drusilla. Drusilla is the daughter of Herod Agrippa the First. So you had Herod the Great, and Herod the Great, he has 3 sons. So Herod the Great eventually dies. He goes crazy. He kills a lot of his kids. He eventually dies. Probably some of his sons probably just never texted him back, and that's why he killed some of them. So that was you that she let. No, I'm just kidding. So the Herod the Great, he has Herod Antipas, Herod Archelaus, Philip, and his sister Salome I. They split up the kingdom, and so these 4 become that they are all governing part of Israel, part of Herod the Great's kingdom. So they don't get to become, so they're basically like governors with even maybe a smaller G. So they are running these different parts of the kingdom that once was all under Herod the Great. That's why, if you're reading in Matthew, they call them tetrarchs, which they've done quarters and they split it up. And the sister Salome, and so they were. What was my thought? See, that's where I'm like that stalker. Several days later, Felix comes with Drusilla. So Drusilla is the daughter of Herod Agrippa the First. Who is Herod Agrippa the First? He is the son. Herod Agrippa is the son. He's actually the grandson of Herod the Great, the son of Aristobulus, who was killed by his daddy. So Herod Agrippa's grandpa, Herod the Great, killed his son, and that becomes Herod Agrippa the First. And Herod Agrippa the First has a daughter named Drusilla, and Drusilla is the wife that comes with Felix. So that is is that right? All right. So thank you. So now here we go. They get down to this part, and who is Herod the Great? His daddy was friends with Julius Caesar, but how do we know Herod the Great? What did he do? Leanne.
He was the one that told, I wish I could be as fast as articulate, but the bottom line was when he was the one that issued the order that the children under the age of 2 needed to be killed.
He is guilty of the great cleansing. He comes in, and when the wise men, the Magi, come before him, that's who this Herod is. They come before him and they said, look, there's a king that's been born. And he goes, oh, I want to come worship him too. Come back and tell me where he is. Away go the Magi. They come back. And so this guy, Herod the Great, he comes back and he says, kill all the male babies under the age of 2. because I can't figure out which one it is, so I'm going to get away. What?
It's called the Great Slaughter, but it was just in Bethlehem.
Just in
It
Bethlehem.
wasn't
Well,
everywhere.
okay. So then he goes, but he has, he also, one of the things, Mark Antony, if you're following along at home, Mark Antony, he comes to Herod the Great, and he has Herod the Great conquer Jerusalem. He needs somebody to conquer Jerusalem. That's how he got control over the whole thing. So he's not well liked because he's gone in and he's killed a lot of people. And so then he has this son that he kills, and that guy has a son called Agrippa the First. Who is Herod Agrippa the First? Acts chapter 12. There's a Herod in Acts chapter 12, and he has Peter arrested and thrown in jail, and they pray, and then Rhoda gets at the door, and everybody remembers her name. And what else did he do? He had James killed. So if you're watching along in the what's that TV show? If you're watching, spoiler alert, James doesn't make it. So he gets to Acts 12 and he dies. So, but then what happens to Herod Agrippa the First? He gets eaten by worms. He goes in Acts chapter 12, he's the one that goes out, and so these are Jews. Because see, this is his grandpa, Herod the Great, was a Jew, was raised as a Jew. They had come over. They're probably Edomites that came over under Nebuchadnezzar II. And so he came over, and he has his son, Herod Agrippa the First. And Herod Agrippa the First is the one, he comes out in a bright, shining robe, and they said, he is a god. And he does not say, no, I'm not. And guess what? God strikes him dead. He's eaten by worms. And he dies instantly. He's dead. Boom. He's gone. So that is Herod Agrippa the First. And Herod Agrippa, he has a daughter, Bernice, and he has a son who's Agrippa the Second, and he has Drusilla. Herod Agrippa the First has a sister, and Herod Agrippa the First sister, it can't be, is Herodias. Who is Herodias? Herodias marries her uncle, if you go back here, who was over Galilee. She marries her uncle. It's not her first marriage. It's her second marriage. And what does she want? She wants the head of John the Baptist. So now this is Herod Agrippa's daughter. So his sister is Herodias, who comes up here. So these people, it's all the same people that you've been reading about through all of the Gospels. And now here we get to the book of Acts, and we get here, and now Felix and his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewish, and they sent for Paul, and he listened to him talk about his faith in Jesus Christ, and as Paul discoursed on righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come. And then he said, that is enough from now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. If you've grown up in a lot of churches and you've heard a sermon on that, it wasn't convenient. And so then at that same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. So he sent for him frequently to talk to him. He sent for him frequently. And when 2 years had passed, everything has been going by, boom, 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 boom. And when 2 years had passed, he was preceded by Porcius Festus, who was, because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. And we're supposed to get all the way to the end of, so he has a trial before Festus. And so they have King, and then in verse 13 of chapter 25, it says a few days, so we can't skip that. Verse 13 of chapter 25. After Festus had conferred with the council, so these people, it's been 2 years, and they bring back these people again. And Paul has to tell his story. He made his defense in verse 8. I said, I've done nothing wrong. And he says, but Festus wishing to, he said, are you willing to go down to Jerusalem to stand trial? And Paul knew he would be killed if he went back to Jerusalem. Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I've not done anything wrong. If I, however, are guilty of doing anything and deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to, it matters where you're born. I appeal to Caesar. And after Festus conferred with the council, he declared, I appeal to go to Caesar, and to Caesar you will go. Verse 13, a few days later, King Agrippa, this is Agrippa II, arrives with his sister Bernice. What's the deal with his sister Bernice? Yeah, maybe King Agrippa, these girls are supposed to be very beautiful. Maybe King Agrippa not so much, because he takes his sister as his kind of like his unwritten wife, according to history. So they have an incestuous relationship. So Bernice is always it's his older sister, is always traveling around with Agrippa II. And it says, so a few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea. Why is Caesarea? It was the capital. But who else lives in Caesarea? Paul's been there for over 2 years now. Anybody remember? Acts chapter 10, there's a Gentile guy that was in charge of the soldiers there. What's his name? Cornelius was from Caesarea. Who else lived in Caesarea? When Paul was coming back down to bring money to Jerusalem, he stops in Caesarea, and there's a dude there that has 4 daughters. Philip the evangelist and his 4 daughters, who were all prophets, they lived in Caesarea. So they send Paul to Caesarea. He lives there for 2 years, and he knows Cornelius's family is a believer. He knows Philip, who is the same evangelist that talked to the Ethiopian. He has the 4 daughters of Philip are there, and so he's got some people there. He's got somebody that's got his back, and so he goes. And so you got to go. But then a few days later, 13:25, a few days later, Agrippa and Bernice arrived to pay their respects to Festus. And so gets a little complicated, because you see, Agrippa, he is like the Jew, but Festus isn't more he's like a Roman. So he's going there to pay respect. He said, it's kind of like if the president were coming to here, the governor would pay the respects to the president. Or if our governor went to Washington, D.C., he might pay some respects to some government official, a federal official. So he comes in, he said, you're new, I'm just coming over. And so they do this whole thing, and they said, so Paul has to tell his story again. And because in verse 22, it says, Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this for myself. And he says, tomorrow you will. So yesterday, tomorrow, boom, 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 2-year wait, then 5 days tomorrow. So tomorrow you will. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice, and they came with great pomp. They come in, and Paul was brought in, and he says, King Agrippa, and all you are present, you see this man. And so I found he'd done nothing wrong, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. And so he writes out this. We're running out of time. And so he tells his whole story again. And let's see, we get to in chapter 26, you get to verse 8, and it says, why should you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? And he said, I too was convinced, and I thought that that was possible to oppose the name of Jesus Nazareth. And that's just what I did. On the authority of the saints, and on the authority of the chief priest, I put many of the saints in prison, and they were put to death. I cast my vote against them. Many a time I went on to the synagogue to have them punished, and I tried to force them to blaspheme in my obsession against them. And I even went to foreign cities to persecute them. And then on one of these journeys, he tells his whole story again. He gives a testify. So then Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven. And so he goes through, and finally it gets to verse 24. And in verse 24, at this point, Festus interrupts Paul's defense and said, you are crazy. He said, you are out of your mind, Paul. He said, your great learning is driving you insane. In verse 25, I'm not insane, most excellent Festus, Paul replied. I am saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things because he's a Jew, and I can speak. And so I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice. But it was not because it wasn't done in the corner. And so, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. And then in verse 28, Agrippa said to Paul, do you think in such a short time you can persuade me to become a Christian. Almost persuaded, it's a song. And so then Paul replied, then the king rose in verse 30, and with the governor and Bernice and those sitting with them, they left the room. And while they were talking with one another, they said, this man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this is the Jew, is saying to Festus, said, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. We're out of time. The next to the last letter that Paul writes before he goes to Jerusalem to arrest. And so they say, you know what? Paul could have been set free. If you look in the Galatians letter, chapter 5, verse 1, he says, Paul's telling the Galatians, he said, it is for freedom that you have been set free. Paul already knew, the whole thing was worth just that, only the last verse. So if you didn't get anything else, they said, you could have been set free. And Paul he already knew, because he had already written, he said, it is for freedom that I have been set free. Don't let anyone else put anything to bind your yoke. We're out of time. Let's have a quick prayer. God, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you for the ability that we have to look and read and study. God, we just pray that you would especially bless us right now as we enter into a time of worship. We pray that you will be honored by the things that we say and the things we do. And we pray that your Spirit will fill each of us, God. And it's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen.